to this seminar. We're really pleased to have Herman on the Werfhorst here, who is nicely tanned because he's working at the European University Institute in Florence, but also previously worked at the University of Amsterdam here in this city. So I think that that's where most of you know his work from as well. And today he's going to be talking about social and academic embeddedness as buffered against school closure effects on schooling outcomes. We have an hour for this seminar. You're okay with clarifying questions, but maybe we can have some discussion and further questioning towards the end. Floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Melanie. Thanks for the invitation. This paper is about, I'm not sure if it was school closure effect, it's about pandemic effects, let's say, on schooling outcomes. And, you know, in this audience, I don't need to explain that we have very nice data in the Netherlands to study school closure effects or pandemic effects, because we have these longitudinal data, and now we have also the LVS, the Living Volkssysteem, data into that NCO system, National Cohort Study of Education. So we can monitor quite nicely how transitions went under the pandemic times. And, you know, following up on the whole literature on studying the pandemic effects, we do the same thing with the transition from primary school to secondary school. But what's more important, what we really contribute, I think, in this paper is that we happen to have collected data, survey data among grade 8 students, grade 6 students in the international language last year of primary school in February 2020, so right before the pandemic hit the country. So we know a lot about the students that went through this transition in pandemic times relating to their academic and social embeddedness. So these are concepts that in education science environment might lead to all kinds of discussions. So I'm happy to follow them. But the idea is that, you know, some kids are more strongly connected to the school system, either through their own personal motivation or psychological traits, or through their parents who are concerned about their schooling, but also connected to other parents. Because we have collected network data, we know which parents are with each other, what is the position of a parent in a network of a class, so how central a parent is. And the idea is that, you know, once this pandemic happened and we could study these nice effects in infrastructure, we thought we should maybe connect that new data that is mergeable with the registered data to describe, not so much in a causal way, I would say, to describe the relationship between those forms of embeddedness and what could be assumed to be the causal effect of the pandemic. Causal in the way that this has been studied in the same way as before. We have a pandemic cohort, we compare it to previous cohorts, and see what is the counterfactual based on the previous cohorts, what would the students' outcome have been had there been not a pandemic. Right? So that's the basic idea. We have a somewhat causal effect of the pandemic, and we correlate it to those measures of embeddedness. Okay, that's in a nutshell what we do. This is a whole team of people that I'm working with. Liuke Zwier is doing a PhD currently at UvA. She works on those network data, PRIMS data, as they are called. PRIMS is an additional module of the NCO data, funded by NRO, and they allowed us to collect network data among students, and with regard to all kinds of subjective traits like academic motivation, measures of grit, or perseverance. I don't know exactly the difference there conceptually, but so these psychological constructs, and a team from Groningen is also busy with this data to look at issues of student well-being, bullying, and advanced strikes is part of that team as well. So that's Liuke, and then Sarah Geven and Thijs are also from Amsterdam, co-supervising Liuke. This is, by the way, not part of her PhD project. And then Carla Haremans is also taking part. You must all know her, I guess. She runs the NCO, is the coordinator of the NCO data. And she has been busy in getting the LVS data, the student monitoring system, into that system, and we need to advise a bit on the papers, but she also takes part. So that's the team that we're working with. This doesn't work.
Maybe because the Zoom is activated, so you need to click on your slide so that PowerPoint is activated again.
But how do we click on the slide?
So there's a mouse back there.
Oh.
Yeah, if you just click anywhere, then hopefully back to the, yeah.
Okay, so some people are a bit bored, getting a bit bored about pandemic effects, and I understand that. So I thought maybe it's good to put this paper in a broader context of what I've been doing. I won't spend a lot of time on this because we only have an hour, including discussions. But the broader agenda that I'm working on myself with many other people, is to look at different types of, let's say, functions of education, the classical social education literature, functions of education, what we expect from an educational system regarding the societal functions of schooling. So we want schools to qualify people, to provide them with skills that are useful in different types of outcomes. We need to prepare them for the labor market, so to allocate students to the labor market in some form, in an efficient way, let's say. And we need to prepare them for active engagement as citizens, thinking about political outcomes, civic engagement. These outcomes, we also hope that education does that, and in the classical sociological literature, this is called the socialization function of education. So it's qualification, allocation, and socialization. And you could think about that this is all final, and this is the end of education. Of course, not. There's all kinds of other tasks, especially when it comes to personal development, for instance. It's not so much part of this, but this is really looking from a more societal perspective. When it comes to these outcomes, we might have two distributional concerns. Maybe one about efficiency, try to maximize the outcome, let's say, best skills, lowest youth unemployment, I don't know, and most active citizens in society, let's say. Right? There's an efficiency kind of reasoning, but you can also have an equality concern about these distributions. Who does what, who gets what in terms of those outcomes. So who gets the better skills, who doesn't, who gets a smooth transition to the labor market, who doesn't, and who is socialized into active citizenship, who isn't. Right? So these kinds of distributional concerns are the basis of, let's say, a broader research agenda. And then I look at different institutional contexts, different institutional variables that basically, differ between societies, how societies have chosen to get to organize education. So with regard to selection and tracking in particular, countries, of course, differ very strongly in how they do it, on what time, on which basis, how many tracks, etc. There's all kinds of issues of standardization that vary between countries. We have centralized tests. Is there some sort of accountability system? Is there standardization of input, of curricula? Also, these things vary strongly between societies. And the vocational orientation is the third main dimension of the educational system, also differs across countries very much. So basically, my last 20 years of my work has been to fill this table, one could say. To say, okay, if there's tracking, what happens to efficiency and equality of school performance? An important part of what I'm doing. If the vocational orientation is strong of an educational system, do we see that the transition to the labor market runs more smoothly? But if you look at those outcomes together, you might also find trade-offs. So if a vocational training system does well to prepare for the labor market, both in terms of efficiency and equality, people with, let's say, vocational qualifications, not the highest level of qualifications, let's say, still find decent jobs, smooth transitions to the labor market in those systems. But those systems might also magnify differences between groups in civic engagement. But that's an hypothesis that I've been working. So early tracking and vocational orientation might in fact be somewhat efficient when it comes to labor market outcomes, but inefficient if you think from a more equality perspective on civic engagement. So this whole idea of looking at the transition to schooling in COVID times fits in this red box, one could say. It's about issues related to tracking, because we have this system in the Netherlands that sorts kids at age 12. That is pretty early compared to many countries. And then this shock happened, this COVID pandemic came over us, and kids had to go through the schooling system through the transition in that year. Both efficiency and equality, one to think about. And it's also related to standardization in the sense that the standardized test, of course, was dropped out in that pandemic year, right? There was no final school test in that year. So it became less standardized, I should say. Right? So what did that do to the levels of inequality, for instance, in who gets to which track in the secondary school system? So that's how this paper fits into the broader agenda. And then, of course, the question is, okay, Pandemic has happened, schools were closed. In the Netherlands, not so long actually, as you might have known, it's only 8 weeks or something, much shorter than many other countries. We might have seen a reduction in learning due to that shock. Let's say many papers have appeared in many countries, also in the Netherlands, showing that the reduction in learning is quite severe. Inequality in learning might have gone up, especially some groups are more suffering from the pandemic than other groups. And I think there's a lot of evidence that basically say, okay, let's compare that COVID cohort that went through that a certain test in the year 2019-20 to previous cohorts, right? I think the best papers out there are in fact using Dutch data. Often many systems have register data or school level data, some registers, so we see a lot of evidence that allows us to compare these cohorts. This is just a meta-analysis by Werfhorst, Anders Sørensen, Bart Sørensen, and Per Engsel. Per Engsel is the first author of, I think, the best paper on COVID effects. I mean, best done technically, also because we have the Dutch data. And here are in yellow the Dutch estimates of the pandemic effects, and the total effect size is -0.40. So in the pandemic, the loss in learning was 0.40 standard deviations. If we then assume that a year on average kids grow 0.40 standard deviations, we can calculate this as 35% of the school year. In the estimate of Per Engsel, the effectiveness of schooling in that pandemic, in those first pandemic wave, was 0. So the amount of closure, 8 weeks relative to a school year, was exactly the loss in learning, so to say, in the Dutch system. So tons of estimates. This is all about school tests, performance tests, and the average effect -0.40. In the Netherlands, they vary between -0.07, Per Engsel's paper, -0.09, -0.50. These you might know by Karel Hanemans and the whole team from ROA, Maastricht. The loss in learning gets stronger with later tests. So the longer the pandemic has happened, the weaker the more the damage. The damage was less per year, let's say, in the second year. But you see, so this is dark yellow is the second year of COVID, and this is less strong than the first year. But you see that there's a reversal in inequality. So the damage, this light yellow is the first year of COVID. If parents were more highly educated, the loss was less strong than when parents were less highly educated. You see this light yellow bars gets less negative, so to say. But the dark yellow bars after 2 years of the pandemic are increasing in negative size, so the damage, so to say, is larger later. The inequality is reversed in the later waves. We don't know. I don't think we know why. Maybe because it was such a public concern. Everybody was so concerned about kids of certain disadvantaged backgrounds that schools might have acted upon it.
Yeah.
Forgot about it.
A small question, because in the pandemic was also a rule, at least in my city, where students of pupils of low SES, they could always go to school.
Oh, yeah, exactly.
Because they made exceptions because they considered it to be a risk.
Yeah.
This could explain it perfectly, right? That there was not really a loss of learning.
Or children of parents who have to work.
Yeah, for this,
outside.
yeah. So maybe you could also, for some, it's really like loss of school hours.
Yeah.
For others, it's actually having
Small classes.
Yeah.
Yeah, and the catch-up programs.
Yeah. I mean, I think all of these explanations are valid and possible. This is just a sketch of the Dutch situation. I think in the current literature, there might be 2 shortcomings. First of all, most of the estimates are on test scores, and for good reasons, very well comparable, and it's definitely an important thing to do. However, at least from a sociological perspective, although I couldn't find good papers on this, so this is really something that might need to do. But in a life force perspective, I think attainment of qualifications like diplomas to get certain levels of qualifications are arguably more important for a life course for the individual than having a certain level of skills. Of course, both are related, but not perfectly. People get skills without education, they get education without much skills. So that, and you know, if you think of the lives people lead, the people they marry, the work they do, it might be that in fact diplomas are more important than skills as such. So we might want to know the transitions that build up those school careers into levels of attainment, right? And the transition in the Netherlands from primary to secondary school is so crucial in this regard. The second shortcoming is that there's not much known about possible explanations. We've already discussed now a few explanations, there's a lot out there, but especially when it comes to the embeddedness of children in a school context, we don't know much about that in relation to the damage of COVID. I was invited to write a commentary on a paper by parental, and then I hypothesized this 2021. I hypothesized that the effects might be stronger on inequality, the school closures effects on inequality, student background slope, so to speak. But are likely to be stronger in primary education than in later schooling outcomes, although that is not found by Engel. So in his meta-analysis later that I showed, there's no difference in the slope in the damage of the COVID pandemic, so to say, across primary and secondary schools. But my idea was, you know, in primary schools, the foundation of the skills are established, and if you then lose out, you know, you might lose out also much later. But if you know, if this has already happened before pandemic, you enter a schooling phase that is mostly about differentiation into different futures, so to say. The damage might be less, and although the transition might be strongly affected by the pandemic. And in tertiary education, we just give diplomas. That's an important part of what we do. We don't only teach skills, but we also give diplomas that have value in itself, in themselves. And maybe that is so important that it can explain the French finding in a very nice paper in economics by Morin of the 1968 strikes in France, where students were all given the diploma for secondary school, the highest level of secondary school. So there was no selection anymore in who finished that level. So there must have been a lot of people who got that qualification who would have otherwise not have gotten the qualification. And they check what happened to those people. And if you just hand out the diploma, they benefit from it. Interesting. So they get more skills, the kids get more skills in the PISA data. They get better careers, make more money. It's very interesting that, you know, handing out diplomas as such, just giving them, has an effect on people's lives. So if that's what we do in education, partly we do that. It could be that school closures have much less effects on higher education. Also, this I'm not so sure I believe it anymore, given the strong motivational effects of the pandemic, especially on students in higher education. It looks like this. So now we study the secondary system. There's a nice overview paper, or let's say a agenda setting paper in Nature Human Behavior about the possible explanations that could be out there for COVID effects, or pandemic effects. Even though they don't study them, they call the research community to study certain mechanisms related to digital divide, access to computers, obviously very important in homeschooling, but also support from schools and the space to study more social, let's say, family-based patterns, and also psychological traits, psychological functioning, such as self-efficacy, of which we have a measure, and some cultural issues with relationship to the academic culture. Those we also try to tackle. So this I don't need to present to this Dutch audience. We have a very nice data infrastructure with the NCO data to study these careers, and I think, as I said, Engel's and et al.'s paper is perhaps the best paper out there as far as I know them. It uses these kinds of data. Ademans has these regular updates, and the whole team from Maastricht. Very nice also to study the pandemic effects. It's nice, but it gets even nicer with PRIPS, our survey that we collected in the group 8, 6th grade, right before the pandemic. So we have survey data, sociometric data, who knows whom, who's affected who, whose parents talk to whom, especially W's. And And those students went to the secondary school system in the next school year. So we can analyze two different outcomes, teacher recommendation and secondary school track. And those are two outcomes that we study. And of course, with teacher recommendation, in the Dutch context, I should really explain what this means. So in March, early March, the first recommendation is given. So this is before the pandemic, right? Normally, a CETO test would be held somewhere in April, and the recommendation could be adjusted, right, in May. Well, the CETO test fell off, didn't happen, so there was no readjustment of this recommendation. So what our outcome is, because it was already given before the pandemic took place, right, it is the lack of opportunity to have your recommendation adjusted. And that recommendation typically benefits children of disadvantaged backgrounds. It is descriptively known. So if that opportunity is lacking, we might see, let's say, relatively low recommendations for children of disadvantaged backgrounds compared to what the counterfactual would be, namely the previous cohorts. So that's how to explain it. And we know the secondary school track, although it's a bit messy, sounds a bit too negative, but it's a bit complicated, the data structure, I think, in the information we have. But we have some level ranking there. So we associate the individual predicted pandemic effect by comparing an individual student in that cohort with the previous student in the same school, with the same test scores in the Werfhorst system, so in the 2 years before the final year of primary school, with the same gender and the same social class position, social background. So that's your, let's say, counterfactual student. So every student that goes through the pandemic is compared to what that student would have done had there been not a pandemic, based on similar students in the previous school year. So in the previous cohort, 1 year before, was then in the 8th grade and the transition to secondary school. So that's the pandemic effect. So that's individual in the sense that we have that for every individual, every school, and depending on their test scores, right, and the gender and the social class. So that individual predicted pandemic effect, which is typical in design as many other studies, in comparing the pandemic cohort with previous cohorts, are correlated to those moderators and just indicators of academic and social impairments. I will discuss what they are. So then, embeddedness. What is embeddedness? We try to connect to a literature on social capital in schools. James Coleman, famous sociologist of education, who did the Equality of Education Opportunity study in 1968, 64, I don't know, in the 60s. Very influential, set the stage for quantitative studies of schooling, surveys among students. He was the one to discover that a lot of the variation between students is within schools rather than between schools. So Coleman has written this whole agenda on social capital that is about relationships between people around a kid. So if people know each other around a child, if parents know each other, if the parents know the teacher, if parents take part in school activities, that creates social capital around the student that allows, let's say, the enforcement of norms. So a kid is more likely to subscribe to the norms if he or she is part of a network of parents, etc., who know each other and can then enforce those norms. So the norm is, let's assume, positive towards schooling, doing your homework if it's homeschooling, logging in at your computer system to get your homeschooling. So social capital should be quite important, actually. Social capital does a couple of things. It indeed enforces norms, but it also provides information. There's also a social capital indicator. My resource, I can use somebody else's resource to get better outcomes myself. That's a social capital, right? So this information that somebody has is a form of resource that I can use for my own benefit. And it also enables the sharing of resources. We have homeschooling troubles. How can we organize homeschooling? Let's ask a parent, or a parent who is more central in the network might be better able to solve that problem for their kids. So we have two types of embeddedness. One is academic. It's really just a kid who has a certain orientation to schooling. We have self-efficacy, school motivation, and grit, or perseverance. Conceptually, I don't really know. I'm happy to hear what you say about that. These are questions, greater questions, if I set myself to it. It's just a matter of, putting a bit of effort and then I'll get to good schooling outcomes. So again, this was measured in February, right before the pandemic took place. Social embeddedness, parents are involved in their children's education. So if parents talk a lot to the children about education, etc., and also integration of parents in the parental network. By the way, all these things are asked to the students. So we ask the students, do your parents regularly talk? So here's a list of my students in my class, 30 names. To which of these parents of which kid do your parents regularly talk? That's the question we ask. So they can just check boxes, which of the kids in the class the parents are in touch with. But also, but also parental involvement is asked to the students. So we ask the students, how often do you talk about school at home? Or do they know what your last grade was? These kinds of questions. So parental involvement asked to the students. That should be important to mention.
And how old are these students?
Grade 8, so group 8. So
did you ask the parents too, or
no? Parents are not part of the whole design. We just ask approval, ethical. Consent.
And but have you tested the extent to which that measure is valid then, given the young age of students?
Not yet, but one thing we'll do, we haven't done here, we also have the network of the children. So one, let's say, validity issue would be if we in fact tap the same network as the children's friendship network. Right? Yeah. And so that's something we want to test. Because, do kids know whether parents talk to other parents?
Yeah, exactly.
If they're not friends.
Yeah.
Right? They might say it only for friends and not for non-friends. Let's say. We don't know that. We want to test that more. Okay. So, in fact, those social capital measures, especially the embeddedness of parents, is what they call intergenerational closure of networks. So these people around the kid that are in contact with each other, show very weak effects in some quasi-experimental or some causal designs. So we did it within school, within individual design, so with fixed effects, where we have repeated measures of integration in high school systems, so it's a bit later than what we study now. No effect. Cameron et al. Have done a proper experiment by stimulating, let's say, network formation among parents. Also did not find any effect. So maybe the effects are just weak, or they might be stronger in the pandemic times. All of a sudden, maybe people rely more on networks than ever. But the debate about social capital is definitely still alive, despite the long history of that concept. So what we do is we establish the pandemic effect. I think I explained that already. Correlate those embeddedness effects to the individual pandemic effect, or the embeddedness variables to the pandemic effect, and then we do moderation. As you see, I don't do mediation. I don't mediate SES differences by those concepts, right? Because I can't, I think. Because we'll have one moment in which we have. I'll explain it later. Statistically, this is a problem. Moderation we can do. We can run, let's say, the models by socioeconomic background to see how important those moderators are. And one theory could be that, especially children with disadvantaged backgrounds would benefit from parents to be integrated well or to be motivated more, etc. So the general hypothesis, I think, is that those effects will be stronger for disadvantaged students than for advantaged students. So as you see, there's no mediation here. There's the socioeconomic background, we don't mediate it. And that has a statistical reason that I will explain in a minute. But this is roughly the interest. We want to know the schooling effect of the pandemic effect on the track recommendation, track enrollment in the next year. We look at the correlations between those forms of embeddedness with those outcomes, and we moderate it by socioeconomic backgrounds, those red arrows C. So that's basically the idea. Later I'll explain why mediation does not work, I think. So this is a nice slide that brings us from 200,000 or 180,000 children to 400 children. So it is a big loss of data, but that's the way it is. So we have the pandemic effect is estimated in the red square, right? So we have two cohorts, control cohort, pre-COVID, the COVID cohort, and from then we have the NCO data, registered data, every kid, let's say, more or less, except in special education. And we have LVS data from them, but only for 50,000, around 50,000 per cohort. So this is 27, 28% of the cohort. So we lose students. First of all, because not all schools have agreed to bring the LVS data into the system. And second, we only have the CITO test because we can't compare tests, as you might know, in the Netherlands. So we have several offers of those final school tests, LVS data, but we only use the LVS system of CITO. So that brings it down to 50,000 people. And of course, because we lose so many people, we can't use our whole PRIMS survey, that is 1,200 students, because of course we need the overlap to estimate the pandemic effect based on the previous cohort, because we need the LVS data to predict the mirror student, the counterfactual student. If we don't have that, it's very hard to find a good counterfactual student, right? Because we don't have CITO tests as a final test. So we need to use the LVS data. So if we then have the same loss of data, let's say that the treatment cohort, for the treatment cohort, we have collected the PRIMS data, but the overlap then is only 400 cases. So when I show the pandemic effects, I use the red data, the red circle data, so around 50,000 per cohort. However, when we correlate the two those indicators of embeddedness, we're down to 400 cases. That should be important to realize. That's just all right. I think I also told this. So now a bit briefly about the statistics. So we have for cohort 0, pre-COVID, a model that predicts their student outcome, let's say their teacher recommendation level or their track enrolled, which is a function of performance in the previous 2 years LVS data, gender, and we do it by class. Point C is by social class, by individual social class. School fixed effects, right? And then individual resilience. The reason why we can't do mediation is that, oh no, I'll get that later. So then we predict what would be, for cohort 1, what would be the outcome, predicted outcome Y, IJ, individual in school J, based on their performance, their gender, and their school fixed effect, is basically to predict the score by that previous cohort, right? With the same PEG fixed effect. So kids in the same school with the same performance level in the previous 2 years in reading and mathematics, and the same gender. And we do it by social class. So the delta is a different score, basically, between the observed outcome of a student in cohort 1, the treatment cohort, COVID cohort, minus what you would have expected based on that counterfactual of that mirror student of the previous year. Counterfactual student, right? So the difference is the effect of the pandemic. That's the delta. So now, why can't we do mediation? This we have to do by class. If we don't do this by class, and we do this, this whole thing, for the whole data, so let's say, we get one average E error term. That's 0, right? The average is 0. However, if we then find a COVID effect, if we then split up the COVID effects, let's say, because we want to do it by social class, which would be the assumption if you do mediation, you can't really do that, because the reason why a certain kid has a positive residual rather than 0 could be because of that social class position of the parent. So if you want to have an estimate by social class, you need to have the whole system by social class, because then you have the average of 0 by social class, right? So you can estimate the total average effect without looking at social class. But if you want to split it out by social class, you really need to have a whole system that you do by social class, which also then prohibits the mediation analysis. So that's step 1. Step 2 is then we have this individual COVID effect, individual outcome. Again, this is not a predicted outcome. And you see this is not by C, by class, because I put C on the right-hand side. So we have a model that predicts a certain outcome, looking at the predicted outcome, what would have been the predicted outcome under the counterfactual, right? It's a function of social class position and the relationship interaction term between that and social class, plus the embeddedness variables. So this is the main interest of this model. And we know to what extent embeddedness is correlated to the outcome conditional on what you would have expected on the previous of the counterfactual. And do that again by CS. And then of course I do it again by C. I mean, there's a lot to talk about. It's maybe a bit complicated, but I think this is the way to go.
Can I ask one question?
Sure.
Why didn't you just use the, so this is like, you can do it like this, but this is not matching, right? So you can also say, I think the engagement data set is in the end what you are really interested in, right? So then you can also work your way backwards, say, okay, who do I observe in the LBS and in the other data set that I have this subgroup? And then I immediately link the outcomes of these children to the others. And then you have more, I think, maybe more a sense of common support and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, that's a good idea. I mean, yeah, there's one way to go. Another way to go, let me think about it, is not so much have a fixed effect here, but have a fixed effect times those P and G. So different slopes by school that you can also do in this system.
In the end, maybe it doesn't even matter. Can give you the same thing. I think the only difference now is that you do the regressions, you construct the counterfactual, but you're not sure of your common support. That's the only thing. And if you would do the matching as well, if you find the same thing, then you're very happy with it. So.
No, that's good. I mean, the reason why we went this way, perhaps, I guess, is that we want to also this step one to have the epidemic effects. And then, of course, you don't have this matching. Anyway, so that's you could also do that in matching context. Right. So then we have two different dependent variables.
It will go away.
All right. So we have two different dependent variables. It's a bit small print, I realize, but it's just that I'm using a rank score, which is running from 1 to 9 for track recommendation level and 1 to 8 for secondary school track. And for secondary school track, I looked at the levels, these different levels, and look at the average score on the LVS system. So in group sessions, so grade 6 and 7 in the Dutch primary school system. So you see, I've reordered them in such a way that they go up, even though one good question is of course linear. I do a linear model, I should say, and that's also something that I'm thinking about whether we should have a non-linear model. That's the way. So we have linear models of these outcomes. That's the way to interpret the results. So we have effects. It's in units of this scale. Okay, I think this is all clear. Oh yes, so as indicators of embeddedness, we have academic embeddedness, student self-efficacy, student motivation, and grit. Those are latent variables measured with several items, so a structural equation model for this. And social embeddedness, we have parental involvement, same thing, also a latent construct. And we have network centrality, which is a sociometric measure. It's a measure of centrality of a parent. So not only how many parents the parent knows, but also how many parents those contacts know. So that if you have a dense net, you have a central position. If you know more people, but also if those people you know more people, then you get a more central position in that network. So these are the effects by socioeconomic background. Look at socioeconomic background in 4 different groups based on income and parents' education, a combination of that. Both can be low, both can be high, and they could be high income or medium high income without a college degree of the parents, or lower income but with a college degree of the parents. So let's say a table of those 2 variables. Track recommendation level and secondary school track, there's 2 dependent variables, and these are bootstrapped standard errors. We can also talk about that for a long time, but I have to do it maybe somewhat different, but you know, at least it gives us an estimate of the significance here. So we have, so again, these are the different scores, right? So this is minus 0.022, meaning that there is damage of COVID, let's say. But it's very weak. It's in units of the scale from 1 to 9, right? So the pandemic effect for track recommendation level is only 0.02 levels in that scale of 1 to 9. It's very weak. And the same effect is actually found for secondary school track. I checked whether this is a typo. It is not. Of course, this is what you do when you see this. But, the effect is stronger though for children of disadvantaged backgrounds. They're negative, minus 0.069, minus 0.038, still not so great. So the effects are quite, I think, quite weak. In the middle, you see a bit of mixture. You see quite strong effects, relatively strong effects for high income, no college degree. So then the effects are more negative. But you see also negative effects here on the highest SES group, both high income and high parental education, of minus 0.032, significant, whatever that's worth in the bootstrapping here. But you know, these effects are there, but they're not very strong. Right? I tried to also calculate it in standard deviations of the dependent variable. Namely, this is all the estimates that we get in that meta analysis, right? Minus 0.14, remember? This is minus 0.007, so there's 1/20th of that.
It's also logical, right? Because mostly in the year before the COVID, they always have the preliminary track advice. So then we have this sense of it would be very, and it's at the margin, because it would be very strange if you would say to the whole block of students, you have to go a track lower. So this is actually very reassuring that it's only relevant for students at the margin, right? Access a question. Do I understand that correctly?
I think so.
Yeah.
So it is at the margin, right? In that sense, it is identified for that for that subgroup. I mean, the relative to the counterfactual. So it's a weak effect. Also, another explanation is that there is an infrastructure, that there are schools of certain sizes, and you know you can't disrupt that whole system at once, right? So there must also be some logic in schools that they want to have a certain number of kids go to the different tracks, right, without anything happening.
Herman, from my understanding, so this is comparing the cohort that got the teacher advice, but then not the CITO test, compared to the previous year.
Yes.
So given that these effects are negative as you would expect and small, is then also the case that normally only very few students after the test get a higher recommendation? I
mean, so there's this whole, so there are descriptions of this, right? So CPB has done this, I think also the NCO maybe, I don't even know, but so it is known that typically the upward adjustment is more given to children of migration background and low SES. I mean, now the schools have to rethink their advice, right? It's legally, they should do this. Whether they indeed adjust the advice is not compulsory, right? It's up to the school still to decide what they recommend. So it's maybe till 4 or 5 years ago, schools could decide whether they want to reconsider a student. They didn't even have to reconsider it, but now they have to reconsider it, but still could stick to their old recommendation. So this is just the pandemic effect, right? So there was an adjustment of the system. There was an adjustment of the so there was no longer a test, right? So but it's compared to the so I don't think so. Let's say if the question was how often does adjustment of the recommendation happen pre-COVID, I don't think this is the right analysis to answer the question. I would have a bit of a different approach. But the implication of it is, I think, that so well, it could explain this. Yeah, that's maybe the way to phrase it. It could be one explanation why the effect is so big. Okay, so the effect has a distribution. These are the density plots, Cornell densities of those, let's say, pandemic effects. Negative, positive, as you see, it can also be positive. Students sometimes benefit from COVID, let's say, in rather than perhaps because there was no their parents being more concerned about it. But in any case, I think the conclusion would be that the effects are quite weak. Oh yeah, this is just a data quality issue. We also looked at the SCS gaps, depending on whether these are different in the PRIMS data compared to the register data environment, to see if our 1100 cases were a good estimate of the gaps, and that's pretty okay. So the interaction effects between PRIMS and a certain background variable are all pretty much insignificant and small. So the PRIMS data are okay to assess gaps, even if the distribution of the social origin variables are a bit higher in our data than the registered data. Now the effects of the embeddedness variable. So these are the correlations, one could say, in the SEM model, regression coefficients of the SEM model, of those indicators of embeddedness, academic embeddedness and social embeddedness, on the damage of the cohort. So positive means less damage, right? A relatively higher score. Less damage. So efficacy means, has positive slope. So in terms of effect size, it's 0.5, meaning that for one standard deviation of efficacy, the level of recommendation or enrollment goes up by 0.5. So these effects are not so big actually. Motivation, a bit smaller, also statistically significant. Grit, less strong and not significant. And parental involvement, extremely high standard errors. I can't really explain why yet, but that positively correlated to the relative position of a student, considering the earlier performance. So, and importantly, network centrality, hardly any effect. So whether the parents have a central role in the class, central position in the network in the class, isn't correlated to the level of damage, let's say, that the COVID had on that student, which is, I thought, quite surprising. So these are the effects overall, and then by SES group, I only looked at low SES and high SES, so both low parents' education and income, or both high parents' education and income. Here we see that well, the effects, these effects seem to be a bit stronger for high SES students rather than low SES students. At least some of the evidence. It's not definitely not pointing towards the idea that children with disadvantaged backgrounds benefit more from those kinds of embeddedness. And parental involvement is also more strongly correlated to, let's say, performance, less damage, COVID damage, if they're from higher SES backgrounds. And the network centrality is the opposite. So if anything, there's a positive association between network centrality of the parents and schooling outcomes, or less COVID damage, if kids are from lower SES backgrounds.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a bit lost. So if you maybe can go one slide back. So these are separate stratification models.
Yes.
These outcomes.
Yes.
So a latent variable of efficacy, for example, and then a latent variable of the pandemic effect, the small negative effect that you just showed, and then the correlation. Is that what we're looking at?
Yes. So this is the structural equation model that predicts schooling outcomes. Schooling outcomes at observed schooling outcomes, controlled for the predicted schooling outcomes had to be not a pandemic, right? So this is the effect or the relationship. These are the effects. The gamma 4 are the effects that you see in that graph. Namely, what is the relationship between embeddedness and outcomes, controlling for what you would have expected in the previous, in the counterfactual. That's how it is.
Yeah.
So it's positive. It means you have a higher score, controlling for your earlier counterfactual situation, than if you have a lower score embeddedness. That's what. And then here I do it by SES, but as I said, here I do it by C, by social class again. So we get, this average is then 0, which is nice in this way. So then this is, and again, it should be, you mentioned it, these are separate models by these indicators, because there's all kinds of causality going on among them that I don't even dare to think about it today. So, but you need, it assumes that, I try to get away from causal interpretation here anyway, so it's always not good enough, the data are not good enough for that. So the effects are perhaps causal, but the correlation between the effects and those indicators for embeddedness, I'm not sure. Again, network centrality might have positive effects to the outcomes for low SES students, controlled for earlier expected outcomes. And parental involvement seems to be more strongly connected to outcomes for students of high SES.
We've got 7 minutes left.
Yes, I'm done. So that's it. I could go through. One important thing I think we should, grid is not so important in our I don't know what you think about this, but to me it seems like this is a very hot construct in educational psychology. So that's maybe something that I'm interested in what you think about it. And there's a broader debate about social capital we should think about. As I said, quasi-experimental research has shown that these networks are not so important. Also here, it doesn't seem too important, those networks. So maybe we overestimated those for the past 50, 60 years.
At least on these types of outcomes in the pandemic.
Sure, yeah. No, but I mean, there's so many other papers now that show very weak effects of those networks. That's it, thank you.